This gospel passage has had a very deep impact on my life. I was 11 years old, and I was going on a camp, one of my first camps away from home. The camp was called Leadership Camp, and it was run by a diocesan priest. Also, a lot of dads helped, many of whom were a part of Regnum Christi. Also, my own dad helped run the camp as well. And even a legionary priest would come in and help in the camp. And so the camp was about 45 minutes away from my house in Lincoln, Nebraska, in a small town called McCool Junction. And the campground was called Camp Kateri Tekakwitha. And so in each of these leadership camps, there was always a motto, usually taken from the Bible. And the motto for this camp comes from this gospel passage. The motto was, whoever finds his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. And so I heard this gospel passage over and over again, and little by little it sunk in. And what I first thought about when I heard this gospel passage was, I know there's suffering in the world, I know there's suffering in my own life, I know there's pain, I know there's problems, and there's two ways of dealing with it, according to this gospel passage. I could try to save myself from this suffering, maybe by running away, or by ignoring it, or doing something else. Or I could try to abandon myself to God. And that was a bit scary because I would probably lose control, and there would probably be a little bit of suffering as well, and I'd have to deal with these problems. So I was presented with kind of these two decisions or two choices I could make. And I decided to test it in my relationship with God in the spiritual life, because up to that point, I was raised in a super traditional Catholic family in a very Catholic environment. Every time I went to Mass, I went because my family went, or I went because I was in school and we'd go to Mass every day in school. Or I'd pray my family rosary together. But up until that point, I never really prayed on my own. I never made acts of devotion on my own. And so, since this altar serving camp, I guess you could call it, leadership camp, really focused on the Bible, I decided, hey, maybe I'll try by reading the Bible every day. And this decision kind of led to another one. A year later, I was 12 years old, and I had the opportunity to join the apostolic school, or the minor seminary. And so I decided to jump on that opportunity. And then that decision led to coming here to the novitiate, becoming a brother, becoming a seminarian. And that decision led to consecrating my life to God. And by doing all this, I learned that through generosity, one becomes the best version of themselves. And you can do things that are seemingly impossible. And to illustrate that, there was a story I heard before even joining the apostolic school. The story is about a man named Father Kapan. So Father Kapan was born in around 1916 in a small rural town in Kansas. And he was a military chaplain, which basically means he would say the sacraments for the soldiers, especially in the U.S. Army. And so his battalion was sent to Korea during the Korean War in about 1950. And during this war, there was a battle, and his battalion got surrounded, and they were overwhelmed by the enemy. And so many of the soldiers escaped and retreated, but some were captured. And Father Emil, he had the opportunity to leave. He had the opportunity to retreat with everybody else. but he decided to stay with those who got captured. And so they were led to the enemy's prison camp. And this was usually called a death march because if you couldn't keep up with the enemy soldiers, you would be left to die. And it was in the winter and there was snow on the ground, so you'd freeze to death if you couldn't keep up with the enemy. And so Father Kapan, he tried, boosting the morale of the soldiers, trying to encourage them, trying to keep them going. But eventually, some of the soldiers, they just couldn't keep up. And so they would just lie down in the cold snow to die. But Father Himel, he decided to pick these soldiers up on his shoulders and to carry them, even if they couldn't walk on their own. And other soldiers, inspired by his example, his generosity, would also pick up their fallen brothers who were dying, who were being frozen to death. And they would help carry them. And so eventually, Father Kapan, he reached the enemy prison camp, and it wasn't good for him because he had very delicate health. He had pneumonia. He was getting sicker and sicker each day. And yet, he still kept encouraging the soldiers around him, encouraging his comrades, and still doing acts of charity. He wouldn't eat all of his food. He would always give it to a soldier who needed it more than he did. And eventually, he was led to what they called the hospital. And so the hospital on that camp was actually the building in which they would execute soldiers. And so on May 23rd, 1951, Father Emil Kapan was executed, and he died. And so he's a servant of God today, and his case is being looked at for canonization. He already has some supposed miracles that they're investigating. But the main lesson I learned from Father Emil's story and from, indeed, this gospel passage was that if you're generous, you can do things that seem impossible, and you become the best version of yourself.